Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to the DM Roundtable for September 2020. This is a chance for patrons and I to get together and discuss topics in tabletop RPGs, and by sharing our ideas, thoughts, and experiences, we can all become better DMs or GMs. The DM Roundtable discussions are open to all patrons at every level of patreon.com/RogueWatson. You don't even have to be an active participant. You can jump in here and lurk to your heart's content, and we are glad to have you. Shoutouts to my platinum patrons, Joe, Will, Tiny Dancer, Nick R, Andy, Manuel, Basil, and Tom. And gold patrons, RPG Papercrafts, Charming Grenade, Pretty Boy Nima, Marco Stade, Vicente, Gilberto, Sean AK, Cert2B, Adam, Dead Lizard Lounge, Sam, Arash, Lumpy Spuds, Jerome, Fatboy619, Scalenia, Nick C. Thank you all very much for your support. This month's topic, as determined by the Patreon poll, is splitting the party. How do we handle when our group goes down different paths? How do we make sure to include everyone? And what do we do when one group activates turn-based combat mode? Joining me for this month's DM Roundtable, we have Tiny.
Hello.
And Sam.
Morning.
Good morning. All right, Tiny, you were here first. When your group splits up, do you go into a panic? Or do you discourage... to either of you, I guess, Tiny first, do you discourage your party from ever splitting up?
No, not really. I mean, it's kind of exciting, I think, as a DM to have a split party, because there is that sense of danger, knowing that, and the players know it too, that they're not at their strongest. So it's exciting for me.
Sam, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm much the same. I've never said no to anything the players do.
Anything?
If they want anything, if they want to do something, I'll let them try. I might ask them if they're sure they want to do it, but if they go ahead, then yeah, that's fine.
I think it leads to some of the most enjoyable moments. I think it can be very challenging for a DM, especially because, you know, it's challenging enough just to, and this is assuming the player split in a dungeon. Obviously, there's different situations where they can split up, but for an example, in a dungeon, you're going to prep a room, you've got the description lined up, you've got, you know, whatever factors in there, some kind of important puzzle clues, or an NPC in there that wants to talk to them, or monsters ready to go, and once the party splits up, then you have to activate like potentially multiples of these rooms and try to suddenly keep all these plates spinning at the same time. It's not too bad, and I don't mean splitting the party when it comes to, like, you know, one person scouts ahead, looks at a room, and then reports back. I don't even really consider that to be splitting the party. I really mean, like, one party goes off in one direction with one task in mind, and another party goes off in another direction with another task in mind.
Right. That can be kind of challenging. I think you addressed this kind of in The Fane and the Night Serpent and Tomb Annihilation.
Yeah.
You had Chris's character, you know, becoming Yanti, and
spoilers for Tomb. You know, I should start having a spoiler warning at the top of all these DM roundtables, by the way.
Yeah,
that'd be easier.
Well,
yeah.
My bad. Well, the party was split, but I think what you did that was good was, you know, the next session when Chris wasn't a part of it, you gave him an NPC to play. That's something I've learned, is that you want to try to keep all the players engaged, obviously, and I think that's one of the fears of splitting the party, is that you're going to lose certain players because your attention is totally focused on, you know, other players. And that's probably the biggest fear for me. And I've learned that you got to keep players engaged, either with, you know, handing them some, you know, NPCs to play that are, you know, well thought out and kind of fun.
And that was an extreme example, because in that case, they had split the party. And I ran into and there's a whole Crafting Annihilation episode about it, but I ran into a very unique situation where I had basically already explained the events that happened to one part of the party, and then it was like, here's the meanwhile episode. You know, if you think like Game of Thrones, it has, you know, you check in with different factions in different areas and different folks, and it's like you might have a whole episode where you don't see like Arya, for example, and then like the next episode you'll get her again. And this was like that kind of thing where it's like we're not even going to see Mannix because we focused on his rituals so much in the last session, and then this time it's going to be meanwhile, here's the rest of the party. But the problem is that person's still showing up. You know, it's like that cast member showing up to work that day, but there's nothing for him to do. So that was an extreme example of I literally didn't, and I didn't want to advance his story beyond where the other players were. So yeah, that was ultimately the solution I landed on was, and actually I had two of them. I had him and Heather, her character Celeste, was there in the same location, just kind of basically looking out for him. So both of them were NPCs for basically that entire next session, which thankfully they were both very cool with it, and that ended up being a fine solution. But that's probably a situation I would expect not to have to run into too often in terms of... I was thinking more that didn't have quite an extreme situation was, to use another example from Tomb, in Omu, when Theron and Mannix led the zombies away, like a Pied Piper thing, away from the compound, and then the other three went in to rescue Orvex. That was a situation where like half the party split to go do a thing, and the other half split to go do another thing. And that was a case where you have to like go back and forth basically, and then that was really tricky because at one point, Team A activated combat. And that's something that I definitely wanted to ask you all about, because something that I struggled with is, you know, we all know combat is very time-consuming in D&D. And what happens when not everybody is in that combat session?
Well, Sam, I don't know how you feel about it, but if I activate combat, I actually have people roll initiative who aren't in combat, just as a as kind of a turn order thing. Like, you know, for me as the DM to make sure that I'm bouncing back to the other players and keeping them involved. Be interested in seeing what Sam does with this.
I'm the same, yeah. Sort of if you've got people in combat and people who aren't in combat, still get them to roll initiative. But the people who aren't in combat tend to be a bit looser with what they can get away with, what can be an action, and so if they're walking around a room or trying to solve a puzzle, they might get more than they'd probably get in 6 seconds, but it means that they get to do a little bit more on their turn, so it sort of evens out with the people who are in combat and are looking for ways to flank the enemy or making attack rolls and deciding on spells, so it sort of balances the time out a bit.
Yeah, that's probably the best solution. It's too bad we couldn't come up with like to use a video game example, the Divinity Original Sin series does a really cool job of this, where one person can be, it's a multiplayer RPG, and one person can totally activate turn-based combat mode, and it doesn't put the other person in combat. Instead, it creates like this radius around the combat encounter, and if you get close enough, then you're suddenly in turn-based combat mode. But if you're outside of it, then you can just go fuck around and do whatever you want. But there's no DM there, so you don't need have to somebody running everything. Having roll initiative, I think, probably is the best solution, because then the game motivates you to then make sure to include everybody, which I think is why a lot of people why combat works well in D&D, because by its very nature it includes everybody. Like, everybody gets a chance to do something, even if that thing doesn't end up being impressive, but at least it's like, okay, now it's your turn. Whereas some people that might not be as strong at role playing or whatever reason, can easily fade into the shadows during every other aspect of the game. But in combat, you get to roll your initiative and you get your turn. So I could definitely see why you'd want to do that. Even if it's weird, if it's like another player is just like talking, to a guard like 3 rooms down, and then the other players activate combat, they stumble into a room and activate combat, that person's like, okay, it's your turn. What do you do? I could see why it's like you could let them either have an extended dialogue or do something else, or maybe give them a chance to hear what's going on. Because the weird thing is, it's hard to not metagame that. Like your character suddenly feels the magic time distillation of turn-based combat mode start. Like, oh no, my allies are in trouble. I can sense this. It's hard.
There are some things that you could do. Have you ever watched Critical Role, the very first episode that they aired, or maybe it was the second or something like that? But
I've seen bits and pieces.
The party split with their rogue going off and doing something, and that can happen a lot. But they had these magic items, which were like these earpieces that they could like message each other through. So even though the party was split, they could still RP and interact with each other, like, what are you doing? That sort of thing.
Yeah, that's smart.
And so, and I've kind of run into this a lot in the game I'm playing in Dragon Heist, where, our party splits a lot, kind of doing different things, but not being very far away from each other. And so I just asked the DM, I'm like, hey, can we get these ear things so we can message each other and kind of stay in communication? And that kind of keeps us engaged, even though we might go our different directions.
That's true. Is that an actual magic item that's in D&D somewhere, or is that something that Critical Role?
That's just a homebrew thing. Okay. I mean, Critical Role.
It's like a sending stone kind of a thing.
It was basically the message spell.
Okay.
But which you can like whisper to somebody and they can message you back, sort of thing. But it really just addressed an issue that we had where we were splitting up and unable to communicate and going off on our own. It just kind of was just a little trick way to keep us connected no matter where we went on the map.
It'd be a fun way of encouraging advanced like stealth tactics too, if players could communicate like that, or if player characters could communicate like that.
Yeah, we were doing that a lot, but it can get really boring if you have for the most of the party, if you have a rogue going off to figure out, okay, what's in this place, what are the risks, because then everybody's just waiting around.
That's true. Yeah.
So just give them ways to communicate with each other, because then that takes away that meta feeling too, where it's like, okay, they're in combat and I know I'm not supposed to know they're in combat, but it's hard not to be pulled to where the action is, because as a player you want to play and you want to get involved.
What do you do when like half the party leaves to do a thing and the other half just doesn't do anything? Or has that happened in either of your cases?
That happens a lot in my parties when people are scouting. It's really up to the DM to.
And the scouts end up going on like this kind of tangent of events.
Yeah, it's really up to the DM to read the room and keep people engaged. And I do try to give my players freedom, but I'll out of as a DM, I'll tell a player, I got to get back to the other party because they're just going to get bored, So it can't be other people sitting around watching just one or two other people playing. So I'll urge them as players to like, hey, let's move things along here and get the party going again. Otherwise, they're just going to be bored, and that's really not fair to them. I mean, especially, I DM a lot of people that I meet on Roll20, so it's not like I have a great relationship with them or anything like that. They just show up, they expect to be able to play, and so I had one time where I wasn't paying attention and I wasn't keeping everybody engaged, and actually had a player talk to me about it, like, that was a real waste of time for me. I could have been doing something else. And I was like, yeah, I'm sorry. I had in my head this was a good idea, and I could have done it differently, like gave him an NPC or something to play. So
Yeah, and maybe you could introduce an element that happens to the party that's left behind, like they get, found out or something, but that's not always, it's hard to come up with those kind of situations too. The example that I was thinking of specifically was in our Storm King's Thunder campaign. Ironically, one of my favorite moments from that campaign was one that my character was not involved in at all, which was, I believe, Brysis and Halfred went, because we infiltrated, a pretty good area we could lock down, and then we had the two of them because they could both fly, and they were in, I think, Corinne cast invisibility on them, and they basically went down, scouted several rooms, found the NPC we needed to saved him. They basically did all of the things we needed to do in the dungeon, and it was really fun and enjoyable for us, even though we didn't have much going on. But I definitely realized, oh man, the three of us are just kind of just chilling here. And I think what Chris ended up doing, I don't quite recall the timing of this, but I think he did have the Frost, or was it? I think it was a Cloud Giant Queen or somebody show up as a something for the rest of us to do, basically, while that was going on, which was smart. I think that happened during that time, but that was something that I recognized was I'm not actually involved in this at all, but the stuff that's happening to the other players is so interesting that I'm still actually engaged. But that's a tough thing to balance.
Yeah. It's all about reading the room. I mean, it really helps if you can actually see your players and you're not on voice only. I definitely feel like I can read the room better when I can see the players. But otherwise, I think you just have to have kind of an internal clock, that I gotta keep engaging all the players, not just the people that are scouting ahead or whatever. So.
Yeah, you're probably not going to make every player happy every session. I mean, that would obviously be the goal, but sometimes it's just not going to happen. And sometimes you're doing something that's specifically just going to focus on, one player. Maybe you even planned it like that too, if it's somebody's personal quest or something. But and players will surprise you too. Sometimes it's something that you didn't think a player would be interested or engaged in. They suddenly become the focal point of that sequence. But I do think that's always the goal, is to try to involve everybody, and splitting the party just creates those interesting situations where you have to, and I remember doing this several times where I definitely had that internal clock, and I was thinking, okay, we've done several beats with this one party. Now, meanwhile, what are the rest of you doing? And sometimes you can just ask somebody and just see, and there were times where in Tomb, people would go through, what was it, the elemental portals or the elemental rooms to get to that one terracotta statue puzzle room, and only half the party went and did that, and the other half just chilled out in the hallway and didn't do anything. And at least I think twice I went back to that group and said, hey, what do you guys do? And that's partly on me, because I didn't have anything for them to do at the time. I didn't have any other interactions planned, or there's so much going on in the Tomb, I didn't have any kind of random events or random encounters, so I could have tried to come up with something there. But instead, they were we're just kind of hanging out. Well,
yeah.
All right.
I do think it's part. I'm sorry, Tony.
No, go ahead, Sam.
I do think it's partly on the player to, unless you've never heard of D&D before, you've heard the meme or seen the meme that you never split the party.
Mm-hmm.
So if as a player you do split the party, you have to sort of expect that sometimes the spotlight isn't going to be on you, and especially in the example that you just gave, if you're saying, no, we're just going to sit in the hallway and wait, then there's not.
Guess what? You're waiting in the hallway.
Yeah, that's at that point you've made the choice, and it's a good DM would come back and say, is there anything you want to do now, or you've heard shouting coming from down the corridor, or your teammates are obviously fighting, would you like to do anything? Or it's a good DM will still sort of check in and offer chances, but unless they go off and find something else to do, or they're in a position where you can bring something else to them, it's sort of on them. Even if you've just started playing, you've been playing a little while, it should be obvious to a player that if you split up, it's going to be less focus on them. It's going to take time while other people do something.
We joke about this in our Gloomhaven game, but there's every once in a while you draw a card that has like a choice on there, and you can make a choice. And oftentimes the card gives you a little story blurb, and you have to choose A or B. And oftentimes the choice is just, do you do the thing or do you not want to do the thing? And that's kind of what you're talking about. Is like, do you want to engage with the thing that it's talking about, or you just want to say, no, we're not going to do that? And we always laugh about that because that's, no matter what the morality is that we're trying to role play or whatever, it's like, well, yeah, we're always going to do the thing. We want to engage with the adventure and enjoy it. But I think that's a good point. If specifically in a situation where some players are charging ahead and the rest are just kind of sitting down chilling, I think that might partly be the players saying, you know what, I'm good. Let's let some other players have the spotlight, and if they need my help, then I'll come. I might come rushing in, but otherwise we're okay to just chill in here and let them deal with something. So, and in that situation, that might have just been the case, where they just wanted to kind of hang back and let the others have the spotlight, which I'm totally fine with. I'm always going to give players a chance, and a lot of times, especially this kind of goes into the scouting part. If you've got part of the party activates. Or finds something that is, immediately exciting or interesting, then 9 times out of the 10, the rest of the party will just haul butt down there and get involved anyway.
Just hearing you talk about the situation where, people were scouting ahead and you had people waiting around and you didn't have a random encounter prep. I'm gonna start using random encounters just for that purpose. Like if people are waiting around and the party's split, throwing out a random encounter like, okay, you hear something coming down the hall. I mean, our dungeons kind of need to be like these living, breathing places, and not all the monsters are just sitting in a room waiting for you to come kill them, Yeah,
I do it pretty sparingly, but actually an example of this, I'll go back to that other example I used, and it wasn't a dungeon, it was an Omu, but when they led the zombies off the cliff was their idea. There was no combat or anything involved in that. So instead I created one, which was the Vegapygmies showed up because they were kind of hunting the players, and they're kind of just goofy little creatures anyway. But I thought, oh man, these are such goofy, stupid creatures, but now that they're down to like 2 party members, this could actually get kind of interesting. And then the other party had to deal with like their little stealth checks and the zombie thing and the role playing. So it created this really unique and I think pretty memorable situation that was not at all planned that way, but partly because the players created the situation, and then I kind of added complexities to it, which could have made things a real bummer had it been, had one side been involved in a combat and the other side just kind of got through their thing. But thankfully, the combat encounter wasn't meant to be a long, drawn-out combat encounter, like to the death or anything, and, one of them ended up running, and we like hand-waved, I think, the rest of Theron's berserkness and all that. And the other half, at any point, could have definitely come, running back over there, but then it ended up being this really funny social encounter instead among the players. So I can't think of a good example where I might have used a random encounter just because people were waiting around and split, though. But I do think it's something that wouldn't be a bad idea to have in the wings. And, combat, this goes back to our very first DM roundtable, balancing encounters, is almost always favored heavily in the players. Even if you look at the monster stat blocks and stuff, it's always typically a player is going to be way stronger. Even if you look at like the hard rating for what the challenge is. But if you start splitting the party, then that instantly starts skewing those combat encounters. So suddenly a combat encounter that might have been, moderate for the full party, now if you've got 3 party members, suddenly becomes a lot more challenging. Although I was hoping that I was hoping the Hydra in the Fane would have been a lot more powerful, given that there was only like 3 party members plus Zendala, but instead they kind of kicked its ass anyway.
Yeah, but you touched on something that's actually a good point. Is when it got to the point where you could just hand wave things, say, okay, you beat them, instead of going through the tediousness of, all these attack rolls and stuff when during that time you're losing the rest of the players. There was just one person left in that combat, and you hand waved it. So,
Boy, I almost think there should be an official homebrew rule for combat in general, because if there's something I've learned from years of doing this now, it's that there is a very specific peak to a combat encounter, and then you can tell when you've crested that peak, and then it's just kind of a sure thing after that, like the relative danger is past, and it just comes down to the final few turns having to trade blows and take out the last of the monsters or whatever. I'm getting to the point where it's like, man, can we just start hand waving that and be like, all right, well, you've beaten them, it's fine. Like, I don't even need to, we're not even gonna do the rest of this combat. Like, the danger has passed. Hand wave it away. And I know that's probably blasphemy to a lot of people that are listening or watching to this, but it's just you can tell when the excitement of not in every fight. Sometimes fights are definitely obviously come down to the wire, but in some fights you can tell when the excitement has faded and it just comes down to oh, we got to go through a whole round of combat because maybe this guy's got high AC or whatever, and we're gonna get through him, and yeah, maybe I might get a hit off, but it's not really going to change things all that much, but instead it's, we could save, 10 minutes or something killing these last 2 minions.
The next time somebody hits, just describe it as
just
that
a killing
hit
blow.
Just severed an artery.
Yeah.
It almost didn't seem like it should have killed him, but it did.
The bad yeah, my only concern, obviously you can fudge the hit points, which I definitely do. My only concern is that in Roll20 specifically, the players very easily, I guess in every game, players very easily figure out the armor class, of enemies they've been fighting for a while. So it becomes tricky to fudge, like, no, you actually did hit, if players really start missing and it starts taking up a lot of time, then it's like, crap.
Yeah, but again, you're just hand waving.
Yeah.
I mean,
its armor is so damaged now.
Yeah. Right on.
What else about splitting the party? I guess outside of combat, it's mainly regulated to scouting, stealthing around, a little bit of exploring, but most of the time I can't imagine parties would just randomly... Well, has this ever happened to either of you, where parties just, without any like tactical sense, just split up? Or maybe they have like an argument about which way to go or something?
Actually, in Roll20, I DM groups just through dungeons and stuff like that, like the Yawning Portal series, and the party will just wander in different directions.
Oh, because they can just drag their tokens around?
Everybody. And the most frustrating thing about that is you want to give descriptions of rooms, but they're all going to different rooms.
Yeah.
So in Roll20, it can kind of be that way too, and you kind of gotta. It's like herding cats. You gotta be like, all right, guys, you gotta stop moving your tokens.
So
one of you just set off a trap.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
Stop.
I will say, for a piece of advice for Roll20 is, depending on the dungeon, especially if it's an area, if it's a more open area, be pretty liberal about using the dynamic lighting or fog of war, whatever you're using, like lines, even if it's not technically a closed door or something, but just use it to cut off, like, especially if it's a cave, because caves are very painful because people can just wander around caves, there's no doors. Just use that fucking line to cut off, make sure they can tell that it's a tunnel that goes somewhere, but close it off so that they can't literally take their tokens and start exploring in every direction, and you're scrambling for, like you said, descriptions and traps, like, oh, well, if you stand there, then you just trip this thing that you didn't look for, because players will definitely do that. I would recommend literally closing those zones off and then making sure anybody going down that tunnel is committed, and then you've got the time and say, okay, and if somebody bumps up there, like, well, what is this? And like, all right, well, just hang out right there. If you want to go down that tunnel, that's fine, but let me finish, at least describing this room and the situation, and then we'll get to you, and then you've entered, it's basically like a loading screen is what you're doing. You're creating, amongst and that's something obviously specific to Roll20, but for sure, I would break up these areas. I haven't had to do it too much in Tomb because I don't think there was a whole lot of those kind of open ish areas, but I'm sure if you watch the videos, you've noticed that I close off certain areas that might not even have doors or anything, and that's the exact reason.
It's interesting. I've never noticed you do that, but it's a good idea.
I can't
wish
think of a
Roll20 had
specific example,
lock
but
the tokens feature where it's just like, okay, somebody step on a trap, I'm going to push a button and nobody can move their tokens for a moment.
that's true. That'd be good.
So,
I think didn't you mention it in one of the crafting annihilations at one point? Because I remember giving this advice to a new DM who was running a game for me and some other friends. I remember giving him that advice, and he decided he didn't want to do it. And then the first session we played, some of his mates from elsewhere did exactly. One of them went one way, one of them went a different way, and one of them went a third way. And I was just stood in the room, and he was trying to explain, going, "Oh, I told you, I told you."
I probably did, yeah. And that's a similar reason. Thankfully, my party hasn't. I think they kind of understand at this point. Like, even if they want to explore around, like, they'll kind of take their time and wait. But especially a lot of new folks, or maybe they don't know the group as much, might just just start wandering around because like, oh, I've got this token, I'm gonna play it. I'm gonna plug it around on this map. Like, no, that map. This is not a video game. That map does not react to you. I have to react to you.
Yeah, I'm looking at the groups I tend to play with are all quite a close group of friends, so we all know.
Yeah,
we're all experienced enough to know that splitting the party is hard on a DM at times, and not always a tactical choice. So we tend to get around it quite a lot, and even when we do split up, we're quite good at getting people back together before anything goes seriously wrong. So it's not been much of an issue for me in my games. The times where we have split up have been quite minor, like taking two separate paths to the same place, and then doing whatever we need to at the same place together. So
there was I think we split up the party a lot of times in Storm Kings in that campaign for some reason. I don't know why, but there was another situation where we literally assaulted a dungeon, the dungeon being like a guild house or something, from two different directions. Like, some of us walked in the front door, and the other half we went like in the basement, I think, and literally went into two different combat scenes. The first half basically fought the entire initial group of enemies, the mercenary, the Zentarum, I believe. And then the bottom half fought like these like animated armor that was like in the basement. And we basically made things a lot harder for ourselves by doing this. But it does make it fun because, at least in that situation, it shines an even bigger spotlight on every player because you've got that much more of an intimate space to work with. So if you only have 3 players dealing with this full merc group, then everything that you do is super important. And same thing with the basement group. If you have 2 players dealing with these 2 enemies, then like every action becomes super important. Versus if you're a huge group of 5 and you're moving in, then even in combat, your stuff might get lost in the thick of things. So weirdly enough, it can make things a lot more exciting. But obviously, from the DM standpoint, that can be challenging because now you're suddenly running, this dungeon from multiple points of view that you probably weren't planning on. And I still don't know why we did that. It wasn't even a tactically sound decision to. I mean, you want to do the smart thing and you do the heist thing, right? You want to plan your heist. If you know the dungeon ahead of time, you can go in different directions and all have a different plan. And that's kind of what you were talking about, Tiny, having that little like earpiece and be able to actually communicate. I think that can be a lot of fun. I think hopefully the DM has planned for that situation because that makes things a lot more challenging, especially if it's supposed to be a living dungeon where, as we said, monsters aren't just chilling in their rooms waiting for the heroes to show up, especially if it's like a humanoid fort or something where we got patrols running around. And it's one thing to show that from one point of view. You can just magically put those people wherever and then they show up when they need to. But suddenly if you're being watched, by the players from multiple points of view, now you have to really keep track of like, oh shit, all right, they went from room A to room D and now they're patrolling off screen and now they came back to room D. But that would be a really fun scenario too. Yeah.
Well, I mean, and all the players, no matter where you are kind of privy to what the other players are doing. It's not like you're separating them in different chat rooms because then it would be kind of weird.
I wonder if anybody's done that.
I've briefly done that.
Yeah. Have you?
But I felt their urgency, like if I'm gonna pull a player aside and tell them something, I always feel the urgency, like I gotta get back to the full group because they're just sitting around waiting for me. So it's not a good thing to do unless you have a message for a player that you want to give them very quickly. And I pulled a player aside to tell him something, and then he wanted to tell me like everything he wanted to do to respond to it. And I'm like, I gotta get back, and I felt bad because I know that player wants to do things, but I can't have all this dead air for the rest of the party, So.
Yeah, that's true. I've never done it. I don't think I ever would. Whispering definitely would be the way to convey information. If somebody's scouting something and you only want them to know, 9 times out of 10 with my group at least, and I think they make a joke of it, whenever I tell them information that's whispered, they will literally just repeat that information, like just completely, regurgitate it. I make a joke of it. Reese especially loves doing that. So I don't know what to make of it. Like at some point, like, well, I guess I could stop, like, trying to whisper it. But at some point, like somebody might. I know, like my wife likes to keep things like close by and play more clandestine. But I think whispering via text, messaging is probably the best way to handle that, and then keeping everybody obviously in the group. And even, because that makes it fun. Like I said, when we split up with that Storm Kings thing with the 2 players went off and did their thing, if they were literally in their own chat room, that would be a completely different game experience. We would know what the hell's going on. But because we were all together and we could still, play vicariously through what they were doing, we were still managed to be engaged in that moment. You're still part of a group. You're still having fun together, even when you're split up. So yeah, definitely agree with.
And that's what it's about. I mean, you can at least be entertained by what the other players are doing.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully that's the case all the time for everybody. But
hopefully
that's what we're doing here. All right, what about final thoughts for splitting the party? Let's go reverse order this time. Sam.
I wish you'd gone the other order. It's from a DM standpoint, it can be a challenge. You're editing combat encounters on the fly to make sure people don't walk into something that's going to absolutely kill them because you were expecting a full party to be there. And then you've also got the challenge of balancing the time between 2 or more groups. But I also think that if you're telling a good story and the players accept the situation that they're in or that they've put themselves in, then you should be able to get around it with enough ease that it shouldn't ever be a huge problem. And I think if it is a huge problem, then it's a good learning point, and it's not something that you'll let happen again.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Tiny, splitting the party. Final thoughts.
I think it can be a lot of fun if you manage it well. Some encounters are designed to split the party, like Gears of Hate and Tomb of Annihilation. They can be challenging. I suggest considering giving your players a means to communicate with each other, even if they're split.
Which the Gears of Hate does. That's like built into that dungeon, interestingly enough.
Yeah. So give them a means to communicate with each other, at least if the party's split. Just kind of develop that internal clock, and based upon reading your players, reading the room, to know if they're getting bored, and keep them engaged. And if you're feeling stressed, like they're not doing anything and you might be losing them, maybe just throw a random encounter at them, and and then the party that took off might feel the need to come back. So
yeah, well said. To me, this is like the advanced class of D&D is knowing how to handle this situation, and then being able to engage everybody. And hopefully it's not a situation where it's just, the scout going ahead and doing all of the things. And if it is, then you still need to find a way to engage the rest of the party. Because if that scout's doing a lot of things, you can go back to the other party and say, hey, what do y'all want to do? So-and-so has been gone for a while. And then maybe you hear a sound coming from this direction and there's somebody coming, or so, create that dynamic situation. Don't necessarily punish your players for scouting ahead, but just, make sure everybody is involved in something most of the time, with the caveat that if you want to split the party and some players do want to just stay behind and just kind of see what the other party does, then you can let that happen too. But I would always definitely check in with everybody, make sure everybody's engaged, having a good time. And I think that splitting the party could lead to potentially some of the most memorable and most enjoyable moments that you can have at the table. All right, I think that will do it, for this month's DM Roundtable. Thank you to Tiny and Sam for joining me. I am Eric. Hope to see you all again for next month's DM Roundtable discussion.
All right. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you.
Cheers, mate.
Bye.